My name is Clara Hayes. I am 34 years old, and if you looked at my life from the outside, you would see a woman who spends her days looking at blueprint schematics, negotiating structural engineering metrics with municipal boards, and ensuring that multi-million-dollar urban developments don't collapse under their own weight. I've spent over a decade learning how to calculate stress loads, how to balance pressure, and how to make sure that the foundation of a structure is completely unyielding before you ever try to build something beautiful on top of it. But on a rainy Tuesday evening in the middle of May, sitting in the very last row of a dimly lit civic auditorium, none of those calculations mattered. I wasn't looking at a blueprint. I was looking at the back of my mother's head, exactly 50 feet away from me. Go ahead and pour yourself a cup of coffee, because we need to talk about what happened that night. If you've ever had to quietly earn your place in the world while your family celebrated someone else just for existing, if you have ever been the morning, an invisible pillar holding a structure together while someone else got a standing ovation for simply standing in the room, then this story is for you. Do me a quick favor right now. Drop your first name and your city in the comments below and type the word boundaries if you already know exactly what it feels like to validate your own worth in an empty room. That evening was supposed to be a regional development gala, a massive milestone for our city's new municipal park project. My parents, Robert and Diane, had arrived early. My mother was wearing her finest silk dress, the one she saves for church functions and high-end social gatherings where impressions are everything. My brother, Julian, was standing beside her, laughing, adjusting his designer tie, radiating the easy, performed confidence of a man who has never had to double-check a single measurement in his life. When we walked into the auditorium, my mother didn't hesitate. She directed my father and Julian toward the front row, the VIP section, where the linen tablecloths were crisp and the brass nameplates gleamed under the stage lights. Those seats, she whispered loudly enough for the organizing staff to hear, were reserved for the people who were actually contributing to the city's future. Then she turned to me. Without a single ounce of hesitation, she pointed a manicured finger toward the darkness near the exit doors. She told me there was plenty of room in the back row, and that I should take a seat there, so I wouldn't clutter the space meant for the main event. She leaned across the folding chair between us right before she walked away and said, clear as a bell, that I had always been the family's greatest disappointment. I sat down alone. I put my bag on my lap, my fingers tracing the cold, heavy shape of an old tool I always carry with me. For the next hour, I watched my family from the shadows. I watched my father lead a standing ovation when Julian's PR firm was mentioned in the opening remarks. 300 people in that room were applauding, and I was just a ghost in the back row. But then the master of ceremonies stepped away from the podium, and Evelyn Vance, the lead city developer, walked up to the microphone. She held a single piece of paper. She waited for the applause to settle. She looked directly past the front row, straight into the darkness of the back wall, and then she said my name. Not Julian's. Mine. To understand why my mother felt so comfortable dismissing me in front of hundreds of people, you have to understand the difference between what I do and what my brother Julian does. I am a structural and urban architect. My days are spent analyzing soil density, stress loads, and concrete curing times. It is meticulous, dirty, and often invisible work. If I do my job perfectly, the building stands for 100 years and nobody ever learns my name. Julian, on the other hand, runs a boutique digital PR and brand strategy agency. His work is entirely about the surface: viral metrics, aesthetic lighting, and quick, flashy sound bites that make people feel good for about 15 seconds before they scroll to the next video. My parents, Robert and Diane, absolutely adore surfaces. For as long as I can remember, my mother has built her entire personality around managing other people's impressions of our family. She is the storyteller-in-chief at church functions, neighborhood barbecues, and dinner parties. And for 30 years, her story has had one major structural problem. Me. I am incredibly difficult to explain to people who need success defined in a 20-second pitch. When someone asks my mother what I do, she usually smiles tightly and says, "Oh, Clara does something with dirt and buildings," before immediately pivoting to a 5-minute monologue about Julian's latest social media campaign or the high-profile influencers he's networking with in the city. I didn't choose this invisible path by accident. I chose it because of my grandfather, Walter. He was a master mason and a self-taught landscape engineer who spent 40 years building retaining walls, drainage networks, and park foundations across the state. He was a quiet man who wore grease-stained canvas jackets and believed that doing a piece of work correctly was a sacred duty that didn't require an audience. When I was 8 years old, he took me out to a historic site where an old stone terrace was beginning to buckle. He sat me down on a pile of gravel, handed me a small trowel, and pointed to a section of the wall that looked completely flawless from a distance, but was hollow on the inside. He looked at me and said, "The prettiest stones are useless if the mortar is rushed, Clara. Build what lasts, not what looks good in a visual clip." He taught me how to respect the physics of weight, how to check a level twice before trusting a surface, and how to look past the shiny exterior of a structure to see if the bones were actually solid. He died during my sophomore year of college, leaving me nothing but his old brass-fitted steel level and a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten formulas for load-bearing tolerances. I still carry that 6-inch level in my work bag every single day. The glass vial is slightly scratched, and the bubble rests just a hair off-center from a fall it took on a concrete job site back in the late 80s. But it's the most honest tool I own. My grandfather used to tell me that a perfect tool only teaches you how to copy a measurement, but an imperfect one forces you to think. My parents didn't understand my grandfather's philosophy, and they certainly didn't understand me. In our household, Julian was the golden child because his achievements were loud and immediate. If Julian scored a goal in a middle school soccer match, it was discussed for 6 months at the dinner table. If I spent 3 weeks designing a flawless structural model for a science fair that could hold 80 pounds of pressure without bending, my mother would look at my first-place certificate, nod politely, and ask if I could move it to the garage so it wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of the living room sideboard. I wasn't angry about it back then. I was just cataloging data points. I was learning early that in the house my parents built, appearance was the only currency that held any real value, and I simply didn't speak the language. As the years went on, that pattern of omission didn't just stay confined to our childhood dinner table. It hardened into the very foundation of how my adult life was viewed. High school was a blur of academic milestones that occurred entirely in a vacuum. When I placed second in the state mathematics competition and earned a merit scholarship that covered my first 2 years of textbooks, I attended the awards ceremony completely by myself. My parents weren't in the auditorium. They had driven 3 hours in the opposite direction to watch Julian play in a regional junior varsity basketball game. I remember sitting in those cold metal folding chairs, listening to other parents cheer for their kids, while my own certificate sat flat on my lap. I didn't say a word when I got home. I didn't complain, and I didn't demand an apology. I simply walked upstairs, placed the certificate in a cardboard file box, and kept moving forward. By the time I graduated from university, summa cum laude, with a degree in structural engineering from the exact same institution my grandfather had attended. The family script was completely locked in. In the parking lot right after the commencement ceremony, while I was still holding my diploma cover, my mother hugged me tightly for a split second, smiled for a single photo, and then immediately pivoted to discussing Julian's upcoming enrollment at the same school. It was as if my 4 years of grueling late-night lab work and part-time shifts at the university's facilities office were just a brief, necessary opening act for the main event that was about to follow. I drove back to my apartment alone that afternoon, watching the highway lines blur under my headlights, realizing that my family's validation was a structural element I could simply never afford to budget into my life. If you've ever had to quietly validate your own achievements in a completely empty room, do me a favor right now. Type the word boundaries in the comments. Let me know if you've ever had to become your own applause, because that is exactly where the real strength begins. For the past 6 years, every single family gathering has followed a precise, unwritten text that I could recite from memory. My father would open a bottle of wine, clear his throat, and spend 20 minutes detailing Julian's rapid corporate ascent. The flashy promotions at his PR firm, the high-end clients he was onboarding, and the vague, heavily implied financial bonuses that my father spoke about with a deep, reverent pride. My work, if it was mentioned at all, was reduced to a singular, dismissive line: Clara is still doing her building projects. They didn't know, because they had never taken the time to ask, that at 29, I had quietly established my own independent consulting firm. They didn't know that by 32, my tiny team of 3 had stabilized enough that we were no longer surviving on small residential inspections, but were bidding on major municipal contracts. The breaking point didn't happen in a loud, screaming argument. It happened 2 years ago during Christmas dinner. I was standing in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, quietly rinsing dessert plates, while the ambient noise of the living room drifted through the drywall. My father was talking to a wealthy family friend. Near the entryway, entirely unaware that I was standing just around the corner. I heard his voice rise above the clinking of glasses as he gestured toward Julian. He said, with absolute sincerity, that Julian was the only one of his children who had really made something of themselves. The only one who had built a real legacy. I stopped washing the plate. The water kept running over my hands, warm and steady, but inside, something completely froze. I looked down at my work bag sitting on the kitchen stool, knowing that my grandfather's steel level was resting right inside it. I thought about what he had told me about the best structures. How they don't announce themselves, how they just hold the weight they were designed to carry. I didn't storm into the living room. I didn't break a glass or cause a scene that my mother would have to frantically manage for the neighbors. I just turned off the faucet, dried my hands on a kitchen towel, and walked back out to the table with a calm, absolute clarity. I had spent years building a quiet professional empire entirely in the dark, and I realized in that exact moment that the darkness was no longer a hiding place. It was a launching pad. The real test of my boundaries didn't come from my family's neglect. It came from their sudden, desperate interest in my professional life. 6 months after that Christmas dinner, my firm quietly won the structural design contract for the Riverfront Civic Park project, a multi-million-dollar municipal initiative that was the largest revitalization effort our city had seen in 3 decades. I didn't announce it on social media, and I didn't bring it up at Sunday dinner. I simply went to work, reviewing topography reports, drafting load tolerances for the pedestrian bridges, and quietly laying the groundwork for a space that would outlast us all. But a project of that scale requires public transparency, and by early autumn, the local business journals published the list of primary contractors. My mother, Diane, is a woman who treats the local business news like a high society gossip column. It didn't take her long to spot my name listed as the principal structural architect and managing equity partner of Hayes Consulting. I was sitting in my office on a Thursday afternoon when my phone rang. It wasn't a casual text. It was my mother, and her voice possessed a frantic, calculated warmth that immediately put me on alert. She didn't ask how I was doing, and she didn't apologize for 3 months of radio silence. Instead, she spent 10 minutes talking about how wonderful it was that our family had secured such a high-profile civic footprint, and then she dropped the real anchor of the conversation. She told me that Julian's boutique digital PR firm was looking to expand into municipal branding and that the Riverfront Civic Park project was the perfect launching pad for him. She said she had already spoken to Julian about it, and they had agreed that I should bypass the city's standard marketing, vetting process and award the project's entire public relations and community engagement contract directly to his agency. Clara, honey, she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, manipulative tone she uses when she's trying to manage a difficult boardroom or a church committee. This is your chance to finally be a team player. Julian has the vision, the charisma, and the public profile to make this park look incredible to the taxpayers. You have the technical access. It only makes sense that you pull your brother into the room with you. It's what families do. Frankly, it's your responsibility to look out for him now that you've stumbled into a position to do so. She wasn't yelling. She was mapping out a sophisticated psychological trap. My mother isn't a cartoon villain who operates out of pure malice. In her mind, her logic was perfectly sound. Julian's was the star of the family, the one who belonged in the spotlight, and my technical skills were merely background support designed to be consumed for his ultimate benefit. She genuinely believed that my hard work was an asset that belonged to the family collective, to be redistributed whenever Julian needed a professional boost. I listened to her speak without interrupting. I didn't get defensive, I didn't bring up the years of being left in the back row, and I didn't let my heart rate rise by a single beat. I just looked down at my desk, where my grandfather's old notebook lay open to a page detailing how concrete handles shear stress. I realized right then that if I fought her loudly, I would just be playing into her familiar script of being the difficult, uncooperative daughter. She wanted an emotional reaction because emotions are easy to manage and easy to twist into a dinner party story about how ungrateful I was. But I wasn't going to give her a story. I was going to give her structure. Instead of rejecting my mother's demand outright, I took a deep breath, adjusted the phone against my ear, and leaned back in my office chair. If Julian wants the municipal public relations contract, Mom, I said, my voice completely flat and professional, he can submit a formal proposal just like every other agency in the state. The municipal board requires a full compliance review for every single vendor attached to the Riverfront project. I will ensure his firm receives the standard request for proposal link. On the other end of the line, I could hear the sharp, triumphant intake of my mother's breath. She assumed she had won. In her mind, my calm compliance was a sign of the same old passive daughter who took the back seat because she didn't know how to fight for herself. She didn't realize that I wasn't submitting to her will. I was simply moving the conflict from the messy, emotional arena of family manipulation into the unyielding, logical framework of municipal law. Within an hour of hanging up, I sent Julian the official municipal portal link. I didn't give him hints, I didn't offer shortcuts, and I certainly didn't alter the legal parameters of the contract. The city's strict vetting guidelines required 5 years of certified financial auditing, clear verification of previous civic campaigns, and an absolute guarantee of ethical data practices. I knew for a fact that Julian's boutique agency operated almost entirely on flash and smoke. He hired contractors on whim, padded his case studies with exaggerated metrics, and relied heavily on superficial, personal networking to secure private business clients who never looked too closely at his back-end data. For the next 3 months, I maintained absolute silence about the project during our brief family interactions. I went about my work, managing the construction bids and reviewing structural core samples, while a completely different narrative was being spun behind my back. Julian had submitted his proposal, and because he was entirely blinded by his own arrogance and our mother's constant praise, he assumed the contract was a mere formality. At Sunday dinners, my mother began dropping loud, insufferable hints to the rest of the extended family. She would pour the wine, look directly at me with a patronizing smile, and say things like, "It is just so beautiful when a sibling finally realizes how to support her brother's brilliant career. Julian is about to take his agency to the absolute top of the civic sector, and we are just so thrilled that everyone is finally pulling their weight for the family name." My father would nod solemnly, raising his glass to Julian, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one who had spent a decade building the professional credibility that made the project possible in the first place. I sat through those dinners in complete, undisturbed silence. I ate my food, smiled politely at my father's predictable insurance jokes, and kept my hands steady. I didn't tell them that the independent municipal vetting committee was already reviewing Julian's submission. I didn't tell them that the city's automated compliance software had flagged his agency's financial reports for severe irregularities, or that his case studies were undergoing a rigorous audit by third-party legal analysts. I didn't sabotage him. I didn't have to. I simply stood back and allowed the strict, rigid structure of municipal compliance do exactly what it was engineered to do: filter out the hollow facades. Julian had spent his entire life building a professional reputation out of cheap, rushed plaster, and he was about to march it directly into a storm of concrete reality. The night of the Regional Architecture and Development Gala arrived with a steady, relentless downpour that mirrored the gray, heavy stone of the Civic Auditorium. The building was an imposing structure of limestone and iron, its massive arches echoing with the low, ambient chatter of 300 industry executives, municipal leaders, and civil developers. I arrived alone, carrying my worn work bag, my fingers brushing against the brass fittings of my grandfather's level through the heavy canvas lining. I didn't dress to be noticed. I wore a tailored charcoal gray blazer and a dark silk shirt. The kind of uniform that allows me to move through a high-stakes city meeting completely unhindered by expectations. My parents and Julian were already seated when I entered the main hall. Because of my mother's relentless social maneuvering and her connection to a junior city council liaison, she had managed to secure a prime table directly in front of the elevated main stage. When I walked over to greet them, Diane didn't offer a smile. She looked at my muted attire, sighed with an aggressive, performative disappointment, and gestured toward the far back of the room, near the catering kitchen doors. She told me that since our table was reserved for the key visionaries of the project, I would be much more comfortable sitting in the rows assigned to the general technical staff. "Clara, please don't make a scene tonight," she whispered coldly, smoothing the front of her expensive silk dress. "This is Julian's big night. His firm is about to be cemented as the face of the Riverfront project, and we need the table to reflect that level of leadership." Your father and I have worked too hard managing this family's reputation to have it cluttered by your stubborn refusal to look the part. Sit in the back, keep quiet, and just try to be happy for your brother's actual, tangible success for once." I didn't argue. I looked at Julian, who was busy practicing a charming, humble smile in the reflection of his water glass, completely oblivious to the structural cracks widening beneath his feet. I turned away, walked down the long carpeted aisle, and took a seat in the very last row, surrounded by mid-level draftsmen and concrete suppliers. As the heavy brass house lights began to dim, I leaned back in the shadows, closing my eyes for a single, profound moment. A memory drifted into my mind, sharp and clear against the hum of the crowd. "They won't ever look at the root system, Clara." My grandfather's voice echoed from his hospital bed, his calloused hand holding mine during his final week of life. "They only care about the bright bloom on top. But when the winter wind hits, the bloom rots in an afternoon. You just keep your roots deep in the soil, sweetheart. The roots are what save the tree." I opened my eyes. The Master of Ceremonies had just finished introducing the civic overview, and the heavy room stilled into a sudden, expectant silence as Evelyn Vance stepped onto the stage. Evelyn was a legendary force in urban development, a tall, sharp-eyed woman with silver hair who possessed that's the kind of authority that didn't require a raised voice to command a room. She carried a single sheet of paper in her hand, her eyes scanning the front rows before lifting to trace the architecture of the entire auditorium. The climax of the evening had arrived. But the story my parents had spent 30 years writing was about to be completely rewritten in less than 4 minutes. Evelyn Vance adjusted the microphone, the slight electronic ring cutting through the low murmur of the crowd like a laser line. She didn't look at the teleprompter. She stood flat on her feet, the single sheet of paper resting in her hand like a structural blueprint. "Before we conclude tonight's civic presentations," Evelyn began, her voice rich with the calm, unyielding clarity of someone who had spent her entire life managing city grids, "the municipal board has chosen to make an unscheduled announcement. Usually, the public only sees the surface of a project. The ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the digital renderings, the slick marketing campaigns. But those of us who build know that a project is only as reliable as its foundation. And tonight, we need to acknowledge a profound structural truth." At the front table, I saw my mother lean forward, her hand tightening on Julian's arm, a sharp, triumphant smile already forming on her lips. She thought this was the moment. She thought Evelyn was about to announce Julian's firm as the public face of the Riverfront Civic Park. "3 months ago," Evelyn continued, her eyes narrowing, as she looked past the VIP section, "the Municipal Compliance Committee conducted a mandatory automated audit of all primary and secondary contract submissions. During that vetting process, one of our high-profile PR applicants was legally and permanently disqualified. The firm failed to meet our basic structural requirements, presenting fraudulent case studies, unverified financial metrics, conveyance violations, and severe compliance violations regarding ethical data practices." The silence that hit the room was sudden and absolute. I watched the smile instantly drain from my mother's face. Julian froze, his face dropping into a pale, hollow mask under the harsh stage lights. "But that disqualification didn't stall the project," Evelyn said, her voice rising slightly, filling the massive volume of the hall. "Because the integrity of the Riverfront Civic Park does not depend on a superficial public relations campaign. It depends on the visionary who engineered its entire structural framework. For the past 4 years, this individual has quietly operated as our lead independent consulting partner. She didn't ask for public recognition. She didn't post her achievements on social media, and she didn't demand a seat at the front table. She simply built a flawless structure that saved this city millions in underlying infrastructure costs. With the board's reluctant permission, obtained via a compliance brief this afternoon, we are overriding her request for privacy. Evelyn lifted her head, looking straight down the long center aisle, past the front rows, past the industry executives, directly into the shadows of the very back wall, where I sat. Hayes Consulting is no longer just a contractor. As of 5 o'clock today, they are the primary equity, partner and lead visionary of the entire municipal development grid. Clara Hayes, would you please stand? The geometry of the room shifted in a single massive wave. 300 industry elite, city council members, and civil developers turned around in their seats, their eyes following Evelyn's line of sight to the very back row. When a person stands alone in the back row of a massive auditorium, the lines of perspective make them incredibly visible. I stood up. I didn't smile, I didn't wave, and I didn't look down at my clothes. I adjusted the strap of my work bag on my shoulder, my fingers resting on the solid canvas where my grandfather's brass level lay. I stood there in my charcoal gray blazer, completely calm, completely rooted. And then, the room began to applaud. It wasn't a polite, corporate golf clap. It was a roaring, sustained ovation that echoed off the high iron arches of the ceiling. 300 people were honoring the work that had been done in the dark. And right in the middle of that room, completely frozen in the front row, sat my parents. I sat down after the applause finally subsided, my movements deliberate and measured. I didn't look at my family immediately. Instead, I watched the room do what rooms always do at the end of a major civic event. It dissolved into a chaotic grid of movement, laughter, and heavy networking. Industry's executives were shifting chairs, municipal board members were exchanging business cards, and colleagues were already moving toward the exit doors. I slung my work bag over my shoulder and began walking down the long center aisle, moving with the unhurried, steady pace of someone who knew exactly how much weight the floor could bear. As I approached the front section, my parents and Julian were standing in a small, frozen cluster near the edge of the stage. The flashy, performed warmth that usually defined my mother's posture had completely evaporated. She was clutching the glossy event program so tightly that her knuckles were white, her eyes frantically scanning the text on the page as if she could somehow find a typo that would erase the last 10 minutes of reality. My father was the first to look up as I drew near. The expression on his face wasn't anger. It was the slow, disorienting shock of a man who had suddenly been handed a measurement that completely invalidated a lifelong calculation. He looked at me, then down at his shoes, his broad shoulders dropping slightly. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping into a flat, processing tone that lacked any of his usual booming authority. "Evelyn Vance," she said, "your firm is the primary equity partner. What was the final valuation of that infrastructure contract?" $650,000 for the initial phase, Dad," I replied calmly, keeping my hands resting loosely at my sides. "Structured as a permanent municipal equity stake." He was quiet for a long moment, nodding slowly, his mind desperately trying to locate himself in a reality where his invisible daughter was the most successful person in the room. He cleared his throat, looking over at Julian, who was staring blankly at the floor. "I told our associates at Christmas that Julian was the only one who had really built something substantial," my father muttered, the admission falling between us without context or an apology, exactly like a raw data point. "I didn't know. I didn't have the figures." "I know what you said, Dad," I told him, my voice matching the quiet stillness of the auditorium. "I was standing in the kitchen when you said it. You don't have to explain it to me now. I understood the metric you were using then, and I understand it tonight. The only difference is that the work I did in the dark just became visible to 300 people who actually know how to read a blueprint. My mother stepped forward then, her face instantly shifting into a tight, desperate smile as she began assembling a brand new narrative in real time. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes as she prepared to rewrite the story for her next church committee meeting. How her quiet, brilliant daughter had secretly engineered the city's crown jewel. "Oh, Clara, honey," she began, reaching out a manicured hand to touch my sleeve, her voice trying to recapture its confident, carrying quality. "We are just so incredibly proud of you. You should have told us. If we had known you were operating at this level, we would have never." I stopped her with a single gentle raise of my hand. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't let a single ounce of bitterness color my words. "Mom, please don't finish that sentence," I said softly, looking her directly in the eyes. "I didn't build this project to make you proud of me. I didn't establish my firm as a message to this family, or as a performance to earn a seat at your table. I did it because Grandfather Walter taught me that the structures worth building are the ones that hold without announcing themselves. I have been building my life quietly for 34 years, and I am going to keep building it exactly that way." I took a half step back, adjusting my bag. "The relationship between us is going to be different going forward," I continued, the words settling into the space between us with the absolute finality of cured concrete. "I am not going to end our family connection, but I am permanently done performing a version of myself that fits into your dinner party scripts. I am going to be exactly who I am and do exactly the work I do. You are welcome to understand it, or you are welcome to ignore it. But I will never arrange my life to be more legible to you again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." I turned away before she could reply, walking past the VIP tables and out through the side exit doors into the cool, rain-washed night air. The drive back to my apartment took 45 minutes, spent in the deep, restorative silence that follows a massive structural realignment. When I finally got home, I walked into my kitchen, poured a fresh cup of tea, and set my grandfather's old steel level flat on the wooden table. I watched the tiny air bubble slowly drift and settle into its familiar, slightly off-center position. It was an imperfect tool, but it had taught me how to think, how to endure, and how to value the integrity of the foundation over the theater of the surface. If you are sitting in the back row of your own life tonight, watching your family celebrate people who only know how to build with cheap plaster, I want you to remember something useful. Your work does not need their permission to be real. A structure doesn't stand because an audience applauds it. It stands because the physics are correct. Build your life with integrity. Build it quietly, build it for the right reasons, and trust the foundation you are laying down in the dark. The room will always fill up eventually. Thank you for sitting at my table tonight. If you want more quiet evenings like this one, where the truth arrives without anyone having to shout, and where the person who stayed calm turns out to turns to have been holding the entire structure together the whole time, come find us on the channel. Subscribe, drop a comment with your thoughts, and I will see you in the next one. Keep building.